Okay, good afternoon, Mark. Really good to see you. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule for this interview. You know, it means a lot to me. Mark's been one of my favourite people over the last year in this scamdemic, pandemic, crazy times. And he's obviously very well known in the truth community for speaking his mind, which we love about him. So thanks very much for doing this, Mark. And for those of you who don't know Mark, he is a UK-based club and radio DJ, author, speaker, podcaster, and also his latest edition is impersonations, which I thought I should add to his list of talents. So firstly, Mark, just for people that don't know anything about your background, when did you get into DJing? How did that come about for you? And what was your main genre when you were DJing as a club DJ?
Well, thanks, Karen. It always makes me laugh these days when I'm introduced as a club DJ, because there aren't actually any places that you can be a DJ anymore unless our slave master overlords grant us back that particular freedom in June, as they've hinted that they might. They've been dangling that particular carrot. Thankfully, I've not been reliant on making an income as a DJ for quite a few years now. If I had, I would have been completely stuffed by now. I've got many friends who are DJs, or who were, and they're now on universal credit. And most of them are severely depressed because they've not been able to set foot in a nightclub since March 2020 with no end in sight, seemingly. But anyway, my own history as a DJ is that I'm someone that got into music at a very early age. I bought my first record when I was 5, and I've got vivid memories of listening to the top 40 on BBC Radio 1 back in the day on a Sunday evening. And I've mentioned in my books that this was always Sunday bath time for me when I was little. And my mum would have the radio in the bathroom at the time, and I would absorb the chart countdown back in the 70s going into the early 80s. And this developed a very strong enthusiasm for me in the pop music of the day. All these songs were going into my head and I was absorbing them like a sponge. And I can still recall so many of the lyrics of these records even now. And they had a very profound effect on me. And they just generated this love of pop music. And in my teenage years, I got a bit more fine-tuned in my tastes. And due to the influence of a school friend, I grew up in a very white kind of middle class area that wasn't known for its ethnic diversity in any way. Very few black people, very few Asian people, but there was this one kid at school who was very much into black music, and this really appealed to me. He brought a radio cassette player into school very often and would play all the music of the time. This was the mid 80s, so he was exposing me to the soul and the funk and the early hip hop and the early dance music, house music that was emerging at that time. And that really kind of got my attention. And so I started fine tuning my taste from general pop music into more black forms of music, black dance music. And I decided at that point that what I wanted more than anything else was to become a DJ, so that I could share my love of the music with other people and hope that they got the same passion and enjoyment and sense of excitement out of the music that I had. That is the reason why most people become DJs, they'll tell you. You know, there's a few guys that become DJs because they want to get girls, or they want to get their mates into the club, or they think it's just some glamorous thing to do. But for the most part, it's because DJs feel music and they want other people to feel it in the same way as them. So those were my reasons. And so I set about setting myself up as a DJ. It took me quite a few years. I was crippled by a sense of shyness early on. I was very socially inadequate. You might not think it now when you see me doing lectures and protest talks and stuff like that. And if you told me 30 years ago that I'd be doing these kind of things at this point in my life, I would never have believed you, because I could barely go up and speak to a girl that I fancied, you know, because I was just so shy back then. So I had to overcome that. And I kind of did it the opposite way round to what most DJs do. So most DJs set themselves up in clubs and start doing parties and stuff. And then if they're lucky, they veer off into radio. as a result of having done the clubs. In my case, I got a placement at a radio station, Fox FM in Oxford, which was the local commercial radio station of the time. And I started out in the newsroom as a dog's body and a tea boy and all of this, and got my feet under the table, got my foot in the door. And from that point, I got involved in all other aspects of that radio station. And I veered over to the programming music side because that was where my main interests were, far more so than news. And I discovered a thing about how so-called news is put together during my years in the newsroom, I can tell you as well. So I started doing programming stuff and getting involved in the music side of the radio station. And that got me on to, first off, what's known as tech hopping radio shows. This is where you got pre-recorded shows or shows that come in via a satellite feed, such as the Sunday afternoon chart countdown, for instance. When those shows go out, it requires somebody in the studio to just be there in control of things, monitoring things, playing in the ads, playing in the jingles, and all this sort of stuff. And so those were the shifts that I did in the radio station. And to cut a very long story short, after a few years of doing that, there was a show that used to be broadcast live from a nightclub in Oxford. And I was the tech op for that. And after I'd finished my tech op shift, I would go down to the club and enjoy the rest of the evening. I was a bit of a raver back in the day. And that enabled me to get a foothold in the club side of things. And I eventually managed to get into club DJing. And this would have been about 30 years ago. And things just kind of spiraled and snowballed from there. And eventually I was able to become reasonably successful as a club DJ through making a few power moves, doing a bit of hustling and networking, bit of hobnobbing, crossing my fingers for good luck, little bit of that, hopefully a little bit of skill and talent as well, and always the love for the music. So I spent quite a few years as a DJ being known for playing predominantly R&B, hip hop, reggae dancehall, soul and funk, disco revivals, and other forms of black dance music. So that career served me well up until about 2014. In 2014, I very much took a back seat from all of that. I had a family by that point, and rolling in at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning every weekend and then wanting to sleep all day is not entirely conducive to family life. So by that point, I was looking for some more sensible jobs. And also by that point, 2014, I'd already been awake in inverted commas for a few years because that process
I want to ask you about that actually in a minute.
Culminated in about 2010 for me. So what I'm doing with my life now bears absolutely no resemblance to what I did for 20 odd years as a DJ. For a start, I was largely nocturnal in the early days. I was living a nocturnal existence.
Yeah, I know all about
that.
That.
Even on my nights off when I wasn't working, I would choose to stay up all night and then sleep all day so as not to disrupt my body clock, which is completely bloody shot to pieces now anyway. But yeah, life now is very different to what it was. But that hopefully answered your question as to how things got to this stage for me. That's
Absolutely,
the last
Mark.
30 years of my life in a nutshell.
Well, I wish I'd actually known you back then when you were DJing and when clubs were open. And let's hope that in the future, after all of this, that's going to happen again. So the next question I wanted to ask was, I understand obviously from listening to your videos and also looking at your website that you became aware of the dark forces in the music industry. Now, you just answered a later question because I was about to say, did what you found from the music industry lead you to become awake in other areas? But it may not be that way around. But could you just explain what happened when you became aware of these dark forces and how it changed your relationship with music and DJ? I mean, obviously I understand that your life's changed, you had a family, but that in particular, how did that change your relationship to music when you found out about this agenda?
I'd like to be able to tell you there was a single eureka cathartic moment where I walked into some forbidden room in a record company and saw a satanic ritual taking place with a bloody great pentagram on the floor. Maybe I wouldn't like to tell you that, but it wasn't a singular event like that. It was a process.
Okay.
And when I think about it, I have always been someone that has questioned and has not been afraid to step outside of the norm.
Okay.
So in my school years, I was never part of the cool crowd. I never fitted in. I didn't have
Right.
a large number of friends. I was largely that weird kid on the sidelines that nobody really wanted in their gang. I've got memories of when I was about 10 years old. I used to spend my lunch hour at school just walking around the playground by
Oh,
myself,
bless you.
no friends, just kind of talking to myself and all kinds of thoughts going through my mind. I was never one for fashions. I was never one for trends. I was never one for getting a particular brand of trainers because all the other
Mm,
kids had it. I was never one for playing a particular video game because everyone else in school was playing it, or watching a TV show because everyone else was talking about it.
sure.
So I think I've never been afraid of going my own way.
Hmm.
I've got very early memories of being anti royalist.
Okay.
I would have been about 8 or 9 years of age. And I can remember back then thinking how unjust and
Mm,
unacceptable it was that one particular family, over and above all others, entirely by virtue of their genetics,
mm,
gets to dominate and control, or ostensibly control, everyone else and sit on obscene, outrageous amounts of wealth when there's poverty in the world, when there's suffering in the world.
yes.
That never made any sense to me.
Mm,
So this is, very early on in my life. But things got to when I was in my 30s, when I really started asking questions about big things in life. I wanted to know why there was always suffering in the world. There was inequality, there was injustice. Why are there people sleeping rough? Why are there
mm,
people that can't even afford to buy a meal for themselves when you've got millionaires and billionaires living jet set lifestyles? How can that be permitted? If there is any kind of God, any kind of creator, how does he or it allow this sort of thing to go on? I mean, we can get into my various spiritual states over the years if you want to go down that route, because
mm,
I've been through different phases there, from attending a Church of England school, which is ostensibly all about God and Jesus and the Bible, to believing that I'd become a born again Christian and attending an evangelical Christian church for 4 years, to
right.
becoming so utterly disillusioned by that whole experience that it turned me into a very bitter, very cynical atheist for about 15 years,
Okay.
to graduating from that to accepting that absolutely there is a creative divine force behind
Absolutely.
everything that we see.
Hmm.
And how absurd, how ridiculous a notion is it that there is no such thing? So I've been through all these different states, but I
Hmm.
reached a point where I was asking all these big questions about life. And it just seemed there were more questions than answers. There were
Okay.
no answers that
Mm,
adequately addressed all these questions. And I started reading a few books, and my dad was very influential on me at this stage because my dad's always been a prolific reader, an alternative thinker. And
okay.
even before I was born, my mum tells me that in the late 1960s, he stumbled upon Eric von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods. And he was reading that at a time that he was working at British Leyland as a motor mechanic, very working class job.
Hmm.
And he was working there with a bunch of other working class guys. And they were all talking about football, beer, and tits. And he started talking about Eric von Daniken and the idea that humanity could have been seeded by ancient alien races. I don't go for that idea myself, but
Mm,
that's where his
yeah.
thought process was at that time. Not your average discussion in a greasy
Absolutely.
old garage where you're putting car parts together. So my dad has always been someone who's not been afraid to think outside the box himself, and he's kind of encouraged that in me.
Okay.
And so at the point in my life that we're talking about now, when I'm in my 30s, he got me to look at the books of David Icke.
Okay.
And up to that point, I was like most other people in Britain. I thought David Icke is this poor man that has suffered some kind of mental breakdown and he's lost his mind. He used to be a television presenter, used to be a footballer. I remember him on Saturday Superstore on a Saturday morning, as well as presenting Grandstand. And then he seemed to go a bit mad, a bit crazy. He appeared on Wogan in his turquoise shell suit and the poor man just lost his mind. And my dad was like, well, did he? Have you actually looked at the things he's saying? Have you actually read his books? Are you going to dismiss his ideas before you've even considered them?
Mm.
So I was like, okay, well, I'll read the books then and I'll see what he's got to say. And I discovered that what he was putting out there in his information actually answered more questions than it
Wow.
raised. And I'd had all these unanswered questions about all these mysteries of life and things that just never made sense. And what he was saying answered them all. It made sense of it all. And I could see the world is unjust and insane because it's specifically set up to be unjust and insane. The average person never gets ahead in life because you're not supposed to get ahead in life. That's the way it's been set up to be.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly it all became so obvious to me. And it created an entirely different mindset and an entirely different way of thinking. And that was it. You know, the process had been started. There was no stopping. It was in 2010 that I read David Icke's book, Human Race, Get Off Your Knees.
Mm-hmm.
And everything made sense to me by that point. And that's when I started to become evangelical about it. I think this happens to a lot of truthers when they first get on the path. You become a bit of a zealot.
Mm-hmm.
You have been affected by so much of the realizations that you've come across that you feel a personal responsibility to communicate that to anyone that will listen.
Yeah,
And it was
I
similar to
agree.
the process of when I was a music lover and I wanted other people to get excited about that new tune that I'd just heard, whether I was
Yes.
playing it in a nightclub or whether I was just talking to other friends about it. Now that I was discovering all these profound world changing
Truths.
truths, I wanted other people to get as excited about those as I had. And so I found myself talking to strangers on planes and in airport waiting rooms and on
Mm-hmm.
trains about all this stuff. And I was probably a bit of a pain in the ass. I was one of those crazy guys that would just start babbling stuff and people just start shuffling nervously and trying to get away. That only lasted a short while. I realized that that wasn't the most effective way of communicating information after a very short time. Also, I realized it wasn't healthy to just be listening to the work of David Icke as I was in those early days.
Mm.
And so I started looking at other authors, listening to other researchers, watching YouTube videos from other people, and I started collating a very wide diversity of information from different sources
Right.
and cross correlating it using basically the trivium process of truth discernment. Not that I
Mm-hmm.
realized that's what it was at the time, but grammar, logic, rhetoric, bringing in all these diverse sources of information, seeing what checks out, what backs each other up, where the inconsistencies lie, and then speaking and communicating what you found to others.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the process that I went through about 10 years, well, about 11 years ago now. And a lot of water has passed under the bridge since then.
Right. Okay. Yeah, for sure. So how did that? I mean, obviously, as you've explained, you read the books, you had the awakening, you started correlating all the stuff that made you realize that this is actually how it all works. But how did that change your relationship with music at the time? Because obviously, you said you were playing a lot of hip hop. I mean, obviously, soul, funk. But where did the darkness that you found in the music, how did that change your relationship with music at that time?
Yeah, well, when I was DJing out in the 90s, the music around at the time was very different to what came after it in the first decade of the 2000s and unrecognizable from what passes for music now
Yeah.
in between 2010 and 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So the music was clearly of a better quality, a
Yes.
better production quality, the feel of it, the sound frequencies, the overall vibe of the music was
Mm-hmm.
superior.
Yeah.
It was party music. The stuff I was playing was music that it was good to listen to in a club, to dance to in a club, to have fun to. And
Yeah.
that's all that mattered to me at the time. My main priority for most of my DJing years was when's the next gig? When's the next party?
Yeah.
Where can I travel to next and
Mm-hmm.
meet some new people? That's all that really mattered to me.
Mm.
None of that means a damn to me now. It matters zero to me, which
Wow.
is just as well because there's no music scene and no clubs anymore. So that's quite fortunate. But It's interesting because I had this idea that music in the 90s, and particularly urban music, R&B and hip hop, was so much better than what came after it. And production wise, it was. But I also had this idea that the music content, the lyrical content, was so much more meaningful than
Yeah.
all this dark and satanic stuff that's come along in more recent years. And I've gone back and listened to tapes of old radio shows that I was doing back in the 90s. And actually, I come to realize that all the time, this music I was listening to was agenda music. It was fulfilling certain social engineering and societally manipulating agendas.
Right. That's really
So
interesting.
I couldn't see it at the time, but
Mm.
there was this trend in hip hop in the 90s. It was largely popularized by Puff Daddy, Bad Boy Records, and many of the artists on his label, and many of the artists that came out at about the same time. And it was this bling lifestyle. It was the creation of the champagne lifestyle, expensive suits,
Yeah. Money, the
Gucci and
material.
Armani, and expensive handbags and expensive shoes, and spending loads of money on Cristal in the club, and having loads of gold rims on your Jeep, and having a gold
Mm.
necklace and all this.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back on it now, from the benefit of hindsight and with a bit of spiritual maturity, all of that was completely vacuous, meaningless bullshit. It was pushing materialism.
Of course.
It was pushing what it suits to have the social engineers of this world have people chasing after, which is this impossible lifestyle that very few people can ever attain. But when you're focusing on gold chains and champagne, it's keeping you away from things that really matter in life. It's
Yeah.
keeping you away from paying attention to what's going on around you, paying
Mm-hmm.
attention to politics or current affairs in any way,
Absolutely.
paying attention to spiritual matters, most importantly, what
Yeah.
your life stands for, where you're going, how you're developing, how you're evolving, how you're interacting with the rest of humanity and the rest of creation. So actually all that stuff I was playing in the 90s was pretty much as bad as what's around at the moment, but I couldn't see it at the time.
Yeah. I
And
get
now
that.
I can. But round about 2007, 2008 is when I really started falling out of love with the urban music scene. Because by that point, the music had changed so much to anything that had gone before. A lot of the production methods and the bass lines and the frequencies were becoming very satanic. It's what I've referred to as demonic sonics. You could just feel it in the
Wow.
way these records sounded. They just didn't feel good. And the sort of stuff that was getting played on the radio then and that most other urban DJs were playing made me feel very unsettled. And there was just
Mm.
something about it. I couldn't put my finger on it, just didn't sound good.
Right.
And I just saw the entire music industry having degraded. There were no message songs being put out there anymore. There were no artists that had anything meaningful to say.
Yeah.
All the music just sounded like it was being done to corporate templates. It all sounded the same. It sounded like it was being churned off of a conveyor belt in a factory. And I thought, well, there's got to be more to know here. I already had a lot of understandings by that point about the way society is really structured, about how it's run by networks and secret societies of dark occultists, and how they control every other aspect of our daily lives.
Yeah, of
They've got a
course.
stranglehold on the world of politics. They've got it through the world of the mainstream media, through science, through medicine, so called, through the military, through big business, through every other aspect of our daily experienced
Mm.
lives. How could it possibly be any different when it comes to entertainment, when it comes to movies, television, and the music industry? And I wanted to make that my specialist area of study
Mm-hmm.
and to realize how the corporate music industry was used to play its part in organized society, in mind controlling and manipulating the thoughts and the perceptions and the value systems of large numbers of people. And I thought at that point, there's nobody really doing this. There are a few videos on YouTube that I found immensely useful in those early days.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the Vigilant Citizen website, which has been a great resource from back then to this day. Whoever is behind that site does some very good work and clearly has some inside knowledge of how things run. But I didn't see any high profile researcher really specializing in exposing how the music industry really works and just coming out and saying what needs to be said. No sugarcoating, no bullshitting, just straight real talk. And I thought, well, that is, I guess, a role that is waiting for me. I've got the experience, I've got the insights, I've got the skills, and I know how to put radio shows together. I know how to write books. And that
Mm,
was the inspiration for writing Musical Truth Volume 1. I'd
yeah.
already written one book up to then, and I'd been a music journalist, so I'd learned how to write. And I thought, well, this is just what I need to be doing now. And here we are, all these years on. And I'm left in no doubt that this is what I incarnated into this reality at this point in the timeline to do. There is no doubt about it. My contribution, my role right now is to be doing exactly what I'm doing. It took me long enough to realize and to get there.
Mm,
There was a long preparatory process. But what I'm doing now, my videos, my podcasts, my books, my
mhm.
live talks, is what I came into this world as the man who has come to be known by the name of Mark Devlin. It's what I came here to do.
I absolutely agree, Mark. And I thank you for that. I think we all do, because without you, I mean, I'm obviously not going to talk about my journey today, but the lot funny when we was talking about David Icke, because an email popped up on the screen just as we was talking about him, so that's quite weird. But I didn't actually have a clue about the music. I was a singer, professional singer for 10 years. And it was only in this last year when I found you. And actually, I'm going to talk a little bit about the some of the Charlie Freak stuff after. But after being introduced to those videos with you, I started looking into your work, and I honestly didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue about the music industry, and it changes everything. It changes what you can watch. It changes what you can listen to. It changes, you see someone and you say, I can't watch that. And it's, so I really, really do have that for you to thank for that. And I hope people who are listening who don't know you, I'm sure a lot of listeners do, but those who don't, I really want them to go and look at your work, because it does really uncover so much. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful for that. Thank you. And that's
Well,
what I was going
thank
to
you.
come to. So you said I understood that you'd written 3 books. I thought Musical Truth Volume 1 and 2, and then also The Cause and the Cure, which was released in early 2020. But you said you'd written one prior to The Musical Truth. Was that correct?
Yeah, I did. I wrote my first book in 2007, and it was called Tales from the Flip Side. And
Wow.
back then, I was firmly ensconced in a DJ lifestyle, and it's not by any means a conscious read because I didn't know any of the stuff that I now know. I
Yeah.
hadn't yet woken up, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a collection of anecdotes and witty stories from my life at the sharp end of the DJ game. Uh,
Okay.
it's based on the experiences that I'd had up to that point because I was very fortunate in my DJ career to get to travel to a lot of different places. I mean, one of my main passions in life has been travel. It
Mm.
keeps me sane. I find it incredibly therapeutic. I find it fascinating to see different parts of the world and to meet people from different parts of the world. And that's one of the things that's absolutely horrifying me about the current agenda.
Me
The
too.
suggestion that we're not going to be able to get on planes and travel around the world again if we don't have a vaccine passport to show for it. Maybe we can
Absolutely.
get back to that. But that
Yeah. We will.
just makes me cold at the thought of it because being able to travel has been a very important part of my life, and I've been very fortunate.
Mm.
As a part of the DJ job, I traveled to in excess of 40 different countries. I DJed in 40 different countries,
Wow.
all over the UK,
Mm.
all over Europe, and some more far-flung locations as well. So, Tales from the Flip Side was stories from those wonderful years as they were while they lasted, of
Mm.
me jet setting around. I mean, I was never part of the DJ elite. I was never anything close to a superstar DJ. With me, it was Ryanair and Travelodge and, doing things as cheaply as possible.
Yeah, of course.
And I don't have too many wild stories of parties where I was snorting cocaine off of strippers' backsides and stuff
Glad
like
to
that.
hear that.
I wasn't really an after party kind of guy. I just enjoyed
Oh,
the club, and then I'd go back to the hotel.
oh,
But yeah, Tales on the Flip Side was me uh, expressing myself and enjoying the process of putting together a book. And
yeah.
again, it's funny how these things turn out, because it seems to me that was part of my grounding to get me ready for
Mm,
writing Musical Truth 1. So when I decided to write Musical Truth 1, I was already familiar with the process of writing and self-publishing a book.
mhm.
And everything that had happened to me up to that point had happened because it was meant to happen. It was developing some skill,
Yeah.
some talent, some useful piece of experience that I've been able to put to use since.
Yeah,
And like I say, it's a very satisfying thing when you realize you're on your true path in life. But sometimes it takes 40 years to get there.
absolutely. And none of it's wasted, and that is amazing. You know, everything we've been through has led us to this moment, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. Even sitting here with you now, you know, it's incredible. So you did your Musical Truth 1 and 2, which are obviously about what we've talked about, the music, exposing the music industry, and you know, for what it really is. And then can you just tell us a little bit about the Cause and the Cure? So that was released in early 2020. That was obviously pre-COVID as well. So what was that about?
Well, the incredible thing about that is, first of all, if you consider the title, which I'd chosen
Mm,
for the book, The Cause and the
and the
Cure,
Cure.
that very much applies to the times in which we're living now. I wrote that book in 2019. I got it
Right.
written in just a few months, and I self-published it just before Christmas 2019. So actually, it came out round about the time that this COVID scamdemic was really starting to gather pace.
Mm, wow.
And uh, the interesting thing about it is I set the story in 1990,
Okay.
going into the early part of 1991. It's very much based on experiences that I had in the radio station that I mentioned earlier. When I got
Yeah.
my job in the radio station Fox FM, that was
Mhm.
from March 1990. That's when I started there.
Okay.
And the novel is full of period detail from those times, because that's an era that I remember with great nostalgic fondness. I
Mm,
had the time of my life in the 90s. I just
wow.
loved it. The entire decade from beginning to end was one big party for me. I
Oh,
loved it. It's
brilliant.
before things like responsibility and commitment and obligations had kicked in. So
Yes. Sure.
thankfully, I was able to get all that out of my system. But
Mhm.
I wanted to have a lot of period detail of what life was like in 1990-91. So you got that aspect of it. It talks
Okay.
about the technology that was in place in the radio station at the time. So it's before computers were doing everything. And it
Mm,
was the last days of vinyl records. So the DJs on the daytime shows on the station were queuing up 7-inch singles on a turntable and
wow.
playing the music off of those. The ads and the jingles were on what were called cartridges, which were loops of 1/4-inch tape, recording tape, inside plastic shells. And you'd load these into these special machine players and then hit the button to play the ad at the particular time. All this stuff is now worked out by a computer, but back then it was
Mm,
manual input. You had
okay.
to manually back time. If you wanted to hit the news at 12 o'clock on the dot and you had 37 seconds worth of ads, you had to work out for yourself what time you had to hit that button so that the news came in exactly on the top of the hour. And this, wonderful times,
Yeah,
it kept your
sure.
skills sharp. And everything was still done on reels of tape. uh, Even CDs weren't being widely used back then.
Mm,
Mobile phones were a rarity, and they were the privilege of just a few people in society. Most people didn't have a mobile phone. It's before the internet, and I thought
mm,
I really want to convey to readers what life was like just 30 years ago, which isn't that long in the
no.
overall scheme of things, and just how society has been transformed by technology beyond recognition in just 3 short decades. So that's one aspect of the story. It's a murder mystery thriller on the surface.
Okay.
And I guess you could say it's in the vein of Inspector Morse slightly, because it's set in Oxford. So the whole story is set around real locations in Oxford. And I've got a photo section in the book where you can actually see how each of these sites looks today, where aspects of the story have been set. So that's what it is on its surface level. You've got these killings going on in Oxford. There's a radio reporter who's trying to get to the bottom of it. There's a couple of cops that are trying to get to the bottom of it as well. But I've tried to structure the novel so that it's layered, and so that you've got a lot of allegory in there and a lot of symbolism and a lot of metaphor.
Okay.
And if you can strip away that top layer of the surface narrative, and you've got the consciousness to be able to recognize what's being communicated, you're going to have a field day picking up all the symbolism and all the clues, the occult stuff, the spiritual teaching that lie beneath. And I was inspired in that very much by the films of Stanley Kubrick, because Stanley was a master at giving you a surface narrative. Take The Shining, for example.
Yeah.
Most people think The Shining is a horror film about Jack Nicholson going a bit crazy and trying to chop up his family with an axe. That's nothing about what you're supposed to get from The Shining. There's probably 5 or 6 layers that you can peel away like an onion and find stuff lying beneath. And I try to achieve that with The Cause and the Cure.
Brilliant.
But what I found most interesting about it is that I started my story on the spring equinox of 1990. So it's the morning of the 22nd of March, 1990. And the narrative runs pretty much for a year. And you have important events happening on occult dates, equinoxes, solstices, pagan festivals. And then the culmination of the main action takes place 1 year after the story started, the spring equinox of 1991. And so now I'm thinking, well, we've got The Cause and the Cure, which ties into what's going on in society now. When did this whole COVID scandemic kick off, in terms of when Britain was put into lockdown and many other countries were put into lockdown at the same time? That was around the spring equinox of March 2020, which is exactly 30 years on from my story.
Crazy.
We're getting a lot of noise made now about restrictions slowly starting to be lifted and things slowly starting to get back to normal about a year later.
Yeah.
So, March 2021, which is 30 years on from March 1991, when my story starts to wrap up. So I've got to wonder whether I was subconsciously channeling in some way what's going on now when I was putting that story together, particularly because when it appeared in December 2019, that's when this bloody virus, so-called, is said to have first emerged out of Wuhan, China. And by the way, The Cause and the Cure title comes from a house record called The Cure and the Cause by Fish Go Deep. And this came out in the mid-2000s. And I thought it was a great title, but it needed to be reversed. Instead of The Cure and the Cause, it should be The Cause and the Cure. So that's where it came from.
That's brilliant. Well, I really I'm gonna get all of these books, Mark. So it's just, obviously there's, what it's been like. There's information coming from all angles, isn't there? So it's really hard to kind of catch up on everything you want to. But yeah, that sounds brilliant. And also, just on the last night of the books, are you currently writing something at the moment? Because when I spoke for you, so what's your new book? Is that about the past year, or is that something else?
I've written Musical Truth Volume 1 and Musical Truth Volume 2. So I'm glad you're sitting down, because you might be surprised at this. It might shock you. But the next one is going to be called Musical Truth Volume 3. Would you believe?
Wow.
The trilogy. That there was the Godfather trilogy. So I thought, well, should really do the Musical Truth trilogy.
Well, I think
so I've been writing that for the past few weeks. I really wanted to knuckle down and start the writing of it all through 2020, but I was just so completely distracted by all the stuff that was going on. And I felt the obligation to be putting all my time and energy and resources to exposing what was going on with the scamdemic. I thought this is a far more urgent task than me doing this book. I've got to wake up as many people as possible, because our very futures are at stake here. Our very fundamental God-given rights and freedoms are being taken away from us. And everything that I've been trying to warn people about over the past 11 years through my books, because I don't just talk about the music industry, I talk about how the control of it ties into the dynamic of what's really going on in society and who's really running things. Governments don't run the world.
No.
Who can't see this now? You think Boris Johnson is in control of anything? He couldn't run a bath, let alone a country. He's having it dictated to him what he must do, what he must say.
Yeah.
And that's why what he's saying is exactly the same as the so-called heads of government in so many other nations, all at the same time.
Yeah.
So I thought it's far more urgent for me to communicate what's going on than to write this book. And so that's where all my efforts and energies have been. But this year, starting in early January, I was able to concentrate enough to be able to knuckle down to writing Musical Truth Volume 3. And I'm pleased to say it's going really well, because it was all up here. I knew exactly what needed to go into that book. It was merely a case of getting the time and the concentration to sit down at a computer and start to transfer it from here through the computer onto the written page. So the writing of it is going really well.
Brilliant.
And I aim to have that book out before the end of this year. So that should be available before Christmas 2021.
We look
and
forward
I've got
to it,
in
Mark.
mind I've got it in mind what the next book is going to be after that, which is going to be a sequel to The Cause and the Cure. So that's going to be my project for writing in, let's see, that will be written in 2023, if we're not all in gulags by then. So assuming
if we're not what? Sorry, I missed that.
If we're not all in gulags or FEMA camps by then. So assuming I manage to avoid that, then that will be my writing project for 2023 to be out early 2024. So I've established a pattern now. I spend 1 year writing a book, and then I spend the next year promoting it and planning the next one. Right. So I'm usually working a couple of books ahead of myself.
Right, okay.
So Musical Truth Volume 3 is the one that's coming out next. And I have a huge section in there examining the response of the music industry and of various famous musicians to the COVID scamdemic.
That is actually one of my questions. So yeah, carry on. Right. Sorry.
Well, in most cases, there's not a whole lot to say in terms of how certain musicians or famous people have responded, because they've just said bugger all. They've stayed completely silent. They've been utterly compliant, and not a whisper has been heard from them. When they have spoken up, for the most part, they've been reinforcing the official government line on COVID, on vaccines, and on everything related to it, to the letter. This is profoundly disappointing, but from where I'm sitting, absolutely to be expected, and no surprise whatsoever. So just the other week, we had a sort of public service ad put out there with Sir Elton John and Sir Michael Caine. Have you ever noticed it's always the sirs? And so Sir Elton John is trying to encourage the public to roll up their sleeves and take the COVID jab. You know, nothing to be afraid of, folks. Just a little prick. Not talking about Bill Gates. You know, just yeah, or Elton John. And then you've got Sir Michael Caine. I mean, how disappointing is that?
That is disappointing. Really disappointing.
Michael Caine, great actor. I've enjoyed him in so many films, but you know, he's shown his true colours. He's a sir. He's just another expression of the establishment, just another owned and paid for stooge and puppet. And there he is saying, please take your vaccine. Before that, we had Sir Paul McCartney saying he can't wait to roll up his sleeve and take his jab because he's in the priority groups now that he's over 70. You got Sir Ringo Starr put out a video on New Year's Eve. He sat there at his drum kit in his house with his mask on, and then he pulls down the mask just long enough to do the message, you know, because otherwise COVID will get him. He pulls the mask up again just at the right moment. Gotcha. You're not getting it out. So it's all the sirs. It's all the sirs. You know, Sir Mick Jagger. I mean, he's had nothing to say, but he took part in that concert, the One World at Home concert curated by Lady Gaga last year, that had Sir Paul McCartney, Sir Mick Jagger, Sir Tom Jones, all these other sirs. Now, one interesting thing about this chapter in my book is that I am calling out some honourable exceptions to the rule. There aren't many, but there are a few. And the main one is Sir Van Morrison.
Yeah, I was going to mention Van.
In every interview now. And a few people have said, you can't trust a sir. You know, it's my own advice really being thrown back at me. How can you trust a sir? And people have said, oh, I don't think he's genuine and sincere. Well, I'm prepared to give the guy the benefit of the doubt until some evidence comes along to show me that I was misplaced in doing so. So he's put out several songs criticizing the lockdowns, criticizing the government stance, talking about how overblown and out of all proportion it is to the apparent threat. He's now taking legal action against the government of Northern Ireland on their stance on live music and the fact that musicians are being prevented from making a livelihood. As far as I can see, these appear to be genuine, sincere moves, unless I'm being incredibly naive here. He's made a record with Eric Clapton as well. Not so sure about Eric Clapton, but still a great song called Stand and Deliver. So you got those two. You got the Gallagher brothers of Oasis, who I've never trusted before, and I'll reserve some doubt about them, but they're saying the right things. They've been saying stuff about masks and about staying at home. You've got Ian Brown of the Stone Roses, former singer of the Stone Roses. I'm left in no doubt as to his genuine credibility, because he's been an awake and aware, outspoken truth seeker for many years. Ian Brown knows what time it is. Ian McNabb, the singer with the Icicle Works, you know, he knows what's up. He's said a thing or two. Right Said Fred, would you believe? Right Said Fred. Came out last year at the time of the Trafalgar Square protests in London. They attended one of those, and they put on their social media that they stood for freedom of speech and people's rights, and it was an interesting event. They got savaged, you know, the media turned on them. Jedward came out of obscurity to have a pop at them. So Jedward are obviously paid shills now. That's what they're doing to pay the bills, you know. And then you've got Chico. Do you remember Chico? It's Chico time. From
I met him at one of the protests, and he's been very outspoken, hasn't he?
He has. He's been talking about, you know, the A word and child sex trafficking and all sorts. So
he has,
from a you know, seemingly pathetic Z-list so-called celebrity on one of these god-awful so-called talent shows on TV, he's shown himself to be an awake and aware individual who has gone away and done his research and knows what bloody time it is. So some of these names are the most unlikely that you would ever expect. But we'll take every voice we can get on the side of truth and freedom right now.
I mean, it's interesting with Van Morrison, because I am going to come on to in a minute about the emasculation of men that you've mentioned in your videos and where are the men. But it was quite interesting with Van, because it's been all my left-wing friends that have kind of abandoned me since this all started, because they think I've turned into some Trump-loving right-wing fascist, and they're the ones who are following the fascism. But it kind of did put a little bit of it did kind of shut them up a little bit when Van Morrison spoke out, because they're all musicians and they all love Van, so they couldn't really say a lot about that, but they're still walking around in their masks, etc. So, you know, not really a lot of hope, but you know, you never know down the line.
Sorry, let me just jump in there, Karen. Sorry to interrupt you, but just on my mind before I lose the flow. Also in the chapter I've got in my book, I'm calling out names that we would have expected to have heard from, or should have expected to have heard from, to have a thing or two to say. So you've got all these musicians who we've been trained to think of as, a bit dangerous, bit edgy, doesn't like the government, lefties, you know, don't care for the world of politics, don't care for the Tories. Okay, so where's Johnny Rotten then? What's he had to say about what's going on? Paul Weller, didn't he used to be a bit of a lefty? Didn't he used to be anti-government, anti-establishment? Not heard too much from Paul Weller. Morrissey, He's always had a thing or two to say about the Queen, the monarchy. He's pro animal rights.
Yeah.
Is he pro human rights as well? Then is he pro human liberty? Because I don't recall hearing Morrissey have anything to say about what's going on. Who's left of the Clash? Now Joe Strummer's gone, but where's the rest of the Clash? Don't hear them. Any of these punk bands, any of these new wave bands, from the heyday of that genre. Not heard any of them speaking out. Aren't the Rolling Stones supposed to be a bit dangerous? The bad boys of rock. Heard bugger all from them. Haven't heard anything from Keith Richards or, Bill Wyman or any of them. What about Muse? Didn't Muse have a song called Uprising that was all about, taking on the establishment and don't take tyranny, folks? Haven't heard Muse say much about what's going on. Depeche Mode put out a song the other year called Where's the Revolution? Yeah, where is it? And where's your song about it? Where are your comments about this? Where are all of them? What about the DJs? What about DJs? And particularly DJs in certain genres, drum and bass, grime, bit dangerous, bit anti-establishment, fuck the system and all this. Not many DJs speaking out. Where's all the hard house, the techno DJs? Not really hearing anything from them. Where are all the rappers? Outspoken rappers, Public Enemy. Hello, still waiting.
I'm still
Chuck
listening.
D, Flavor Flav, anything to say? No, okay. KRS-One, anything to say about the scamdemic? No, nothing from them. No.
It is absolutely.
So, you learn a lot by what people don't say, as well as what they do say. Absolutely. Sorry, I just wanted to make that point.
No, it's absolutely relevant to what I was coming to after. I think I said to you before in a conversation that I've, a local punk band, I don't want to call them out, but their slogan has been kick out the Tories for forever. And now the lead singer of that is walking around with a mask on saying kick out the Tories. You just couldn't make it up. It's absolutely crazy.
Kick out the Tories, but wear your mask.
And bend over so you can have your anal swab. But it's unbelievable. And it is, that has been one of the hardest lessons for me in the last year. That, like everything you just said about the people that you thought were edgy and anti-establishment had also just completely bent over. And it's absolutely shocking. It really is.
Billy Bragg, anyone? No? Okay.
Sorry, what was that?
Billy Bragg.
Oh, I know.
Billy Bragg used to, never had any problem saying how he felt, but I guess he's knocking on a bit now.
But it does seem to be, doesn't it? And this was one of the questions favorable. As we're talking about it, then we might as well continue. But it does appear, and you've said it before in videos, but it does appear to be the left that seem to be the most complicit and most compliant. And that is what has really shocked me. So when, I did my first live video last March because I just couldn't believe this happened. And although I hadn't been, I'd followed David Icke for years. I'd always went to him as a go-to when something big happened, but I'd lived abroad, was getting on with my life, didn't really, take much notice, although I had the knowledge there. And then this happened, and I came out and just said, look, this is global. This is not about left and right anymore. This is massive, And it was all my left-wing friends that completely just abandoned me. And then it was the same left-wing friends that were kneeling in the local park for BLM and virtual signalling. And it was horrifying for me. It was absolutely, because I just couldn't see. I'm just lost, actually. I'm lost at how the cognitive dissonance is so great. It's really. So you mentioned in it was a very small video, but you mentioned about the emasculation of men, and you talked about it in relation to the music industry and how hip hop, in the past it was men, and now they're kind of effeminizing men and stuff. But hang on, let me ask what my question was. I left my flow 1 second. So that's what I was going to say. Sorry, so you've talked about where are all the men in this. Why do you think that these people that we've just said, what is it that has made them so, because it's got to be fear, surely, Mark. I mean, what What is it? Why are they not standing up?
Well, as well as fear, there's a hell of a lot of mind control that's gone on.
Yeah.
The instigators of the biggest scam ever pulled on humanity, which is what COVID and everything that's coming in its wake is,
absolutely,
must have been very, very sure of themselves to have had the audacity to do it on the scale that they have.
Yeah.
Because if they misjudged it, if they called it wrong, they risked calling attention to themselves and getting to a point where there'd be no turning back. They'd have been completely exposed.
Mm.
The people would have turned on them and they'd be finished.
Yeah, it's true.
They seem to have operated with absolute assurance that that was never going to take place.
Yeah.
They've gone about this whole thing with hubris, with arrogance. They've even morbidly, satanically mocked us with many of the things they've been doing.
Mm.
They've been mocking us with the dancing nurses videos, with telling us you got to bend over and have an anal swab. That's Klaus Schwab's wife, by the way, anal swab. But you know, what are they telling you? They're symbolically letting you know that they're sticking it to you up the arse. They're not even,
no, they're not
making any bones about it now. Matt Hancock appears on TV with Piers Morgan and he's laughing because of the psychopathic abomination that he is.
Yeah.
He's laughing when he says, we've given the first vaccine dose to a guy called William Shakespeare. Because they're telling you it's a play.
Yeah.
It's a tragedy. Absolutely. And the most tragic thing of all is you, ignorant bastards out there, can't even see it for what it is. So not only were they confident enough that they would get away with it, they've even had their jollies by mocking us along the way. And it's particularly mocking for those of us that can see what's going on, the relatively small number of us, because the vast majority can't even see that it is mockery. That's the most frustrating burden that the likes of us have to carry around. But I think there was a long preparatory period of social engineering that went on to ensure that the controllers had society exactly where it needed it before they unrolled this most monumental and audacious of stunts. And a big part of that would have been ensuring that there would be no significant pushback and uprising from militias of real men standing in their sacred masculinity, standing up for true rights, true freedom, and right action, and taking that responsibility upon themselves on behalf of the rest of society to put down tyranny and to restore freedom. We've seen nothing getting any remotely close to that happening in any of the countries around the world, from what I can see. The country which always had the most potential for there to be any kind of an uprising, any kind of a militia like that, would have been the United States, because you have freedom-loving patriots in the United States. You have real men who have a cabinet full of firearms in the United States. And we could be going down another rabbit hole here, but when you get into the whole Q narrative of the past year, you've had a lot of American patriots buying into the idea that there is this faction of, they're called white hats, you know, military generals and other military individuals who have formed an alliance to take down the deep state cabal and oppose the control system and start to dismantle it and hold all these criminals accountable for their actions, working in conjunction with President Donald Trump. I have to now wonder very much whether that whole narrative was cooked up in advance as a part of this whole COVID scenario as a way of keeping what would otherwise have been large numbers of gun-toting American patriots taking it to the streets with their firearms, instead keeping them pacified and satisfied that the battle is being fought by other parties and they can just stand down, stay at home and wait for the results to show themselves. Because I think that would have been a dynamic that we would ordinarily have seen in the United States. Not so other countries, and particularly Britain. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and they were saying, if you think back to the glory days is the wrong phrase to use, but the days in which football hooliganism was rife on the terraces, 1970s, 1980s, where you would have large numbers of, I hesitate to use the term real men, because the kind of mindless violence that took place, you know, in those days is nothing to look up to or respect in any way. But it was expressions of physical violence, and a great deal of angst and passion was getting unleashed. Now, where is that dynamic now? Where is that spirit gone within men? As I say, those expressions of it are nothing to be proud of, but any hint of that within British males, for the most part, seems to have gone.
It does.
I've seen what would appear to be real men out and about. I see them in supermarket queues. I see them walking around in the street, and they've got the masks on, and they're doing what they're told. They're not creating any fuss. Little 16-year-old junior on the door of Lidl says, "Can you wait outside, please?" And you've got these big, strapping men with muscles, with tattoos, shaven heads, earrings, and a nice blue mask. And they're like, "All right, mate, yeah." And then when the 16-year-old tells them they can go in, only then do they go in. Just absolute compliance, absolute acquiescence from big, strapping, physically strong men. They're not getting upset. They're not getting mad. They're not outraged at the loss of rights and freedoms for them and their families that we're seeing here. They've fallen for the mind control. They've fallen for the propaganda. And that's social engineering. That's how it gets done. So I think you've had psychologists, you've had social scientists, you've had those whose full-time jobs it is to study the human psyche and anthropology. And they know that over the course of many years and decades, through fluoridation of the water, which makes people docile, through additives to food and drink, which can have largely the same effect, through exposure to EMFs and radiation and all kinds of pollutants in the atmosphere, the combination of all these factors, plus all the mind control and the social engineering that you get through television programs, films, even music, they knew they had the general public right where they wanted them. And so they felt confident enough to launch their scam, knowing that there would not be any kind of significant physical pushback from factions of society that they would have to worry about. And didn't they get that absolutely right in terms of their estimation of that dynamic? So it's profoundly disappointing to me that there don't seem to be real men left who stand in right action and who have any concept of what's really important in our lives. Freedom being the number one. What could be more important than your personal freedom? Instead, you've got big strapping men with tattoos and shaven heads and earrings making YouTube videos about a nice pasta they made last night while they're on lockdown. That should not be happening.
Sorry, Mark, but you are hilarious. You really do. You touch the nerve, and it's so true. It's so sad, but true. And you know, the intellects, that's the thing. It's not just the big strapping men with their tattoos, it's their so-called intellectuals. And that's what I can't, you know, the Guardian reading
Exactly.
intellectuals who supposedly have a brain. I just,
That's the other end of it, isn't it?
yeah,
Educated idiots,
yeah,
those who consider themselves intelligent, they
exactly.
consider themselves sensible. They've been to university, they're
Yeah.
nobody's fool. They know what's what. I'm going to call him out because he's a bloody idiot. I had the head teacher of one of my daughter's schools who had to come to the house a couple of weeks ago to drop off a laptop from the school so that my daughter could do her schoolwork from home.
Mm-hmm.
So he comes to the door. I open the door. He's 6 feet back. He's got his mask on and he's holding out the laptop like this, keeping as far away as he can as possible. And I said, it's okay, you can come close. Oh, no, I better, distance. And then he has to hand me a clipboard with a form on, and I'm supposed to sign the form to say that I've taken the laptop. And he goes like this. Are you okay with my pen, or do you want to use your own?
Oh, my God.
He's seriously implying that COVID could have come out of his nostril, landed on the pen, stayed on the pen, he hands the pen, and then COVID suddenly goes like in the film Alien, where John Hurt's examining that alien thing, and he's looking at it and studying it, and then all of a sudden it goes onto his face. That's what COVID does. So this is the headmaster of a school, an educated man.
I know.
And he thinks that a virus can live on a pen and then jump off a pen up your nostril.
Absolutely.
So what hope is there when these are the people that have been through the so-called education system?
Exactly.
And it's the Guardian readers, it's the BBC Newsnight watchers, Radio 4 listeners. It's the so-called intellectuals that are the worst, because they follow the government's and the BBC's narrative to the letter.
They do.
And they take that superior tone as if you're ignorant, you're just a pleb, you haven't studied like they have. They know what a virus is because, Dr. Fauci told them and Bill Gates told them. And
we can't possibly learn anything off YouTube. That's one of the patronizing things of work as well. Very early on in this, the sarcasm about, all these people who think they're experts because they watch YouTube. Well, I've learned so much more off YouTube than I'm ever going to learn from the BBC. So
years ago, I challenged my family GP on the contents of vaccines.
Right.
So I said to him, can you tell me why it is that they put things like aborted fetal tissue and monkey brain tissue and formaldehyde and thimerosal, mercury, why is it a good idea to put that stuff in your veins? And he said to me, where did you hear all that? I said, well, I researched it on the internet. And he said, I wouldn't believe everything you read on the internet if I were you. No, just trust your doctor instead. Absolutely. Because, he's not been indoctrinated by the big pharmaceutical cartels. He hasn't got personal interests from Bill Gates having a say in all this sort of thing. You can trust your doctor, but don't trust the internet. Don't go and do any research yourself. There's a good boy. Don't know what you might find.
It's absolutely incredible, isn't it? It's sad, but it is where we're at. Hopefully in March, now the weather's brightening up, we'll have more protests. So will you be at any protest, Mark, in the future? Are you planning to get out there and pick the momentum back up?
You're absolutely right. The spring is on its way, and I think that is going to pull people out in their droves. I think we saw a pretty good response last year to the protest events. Large numbers were coming out just as the weather started to get colder, and then over the winter months, as we were plunged into lockdown, they obviously fizzled out. But I think they are going to come back again with a vengeance in the weeks and months to come. And apparently there's a big one on the 20th of March.
That's right.
And this is happening all over the world, a World Freedom Day. And people of every nation are being encouraged to get out on the streets and make a very visible and vocal form of kickback to the tyranny that's going on for all to see. So there is one in London. I'm not sure of the location, but on the 20th of March, I think there's going to be a lot of people out. And I think these protests are going to continue through the spring and summer months. And they're only going to gain momentum now. because there's going to be that many more people that have woken up to the truth and the horror of what's really going on in the past few weeks and months. And if we saw big things in 2020, we ain't seen nothing yet in terms of what that kickback is going to look like in 2021, I feel.
Absolutely. So on that note, obviously, you know, we're still in the agenda of Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. We're going to try and do our kickback, but they're obviously still going to push their agenda. We've spoken a little bit about Q. I don't want to go into that too much, but because you've kind of answered the question, I was going to say, like the interview you had with Charlie Frick. I mean, I absolutely love Charlie and Colleen, and that was how I first got to know you, was when he was doing the takedown of the cabal, I think it was, or the A to Z of the takedown. Obviously, we haven't seen any evidence of that, you know, in terms of Trump being in control. So we've. How do you feel? I'm going to come back onto the agendas in a minute, but how do you feel about those interviews now when you think back of all the, because Charlie obviously was really passionate and believable actually, but it doesn't appear that anything he said, particularly in that video, I mean, he's, you know, as I say, he's fantastic. There's so much stuff he's done that I really love, but it doesn't appear that that video in particular has any kind of weight behind it, really.
Yeah. Well, I'll happily address all of that. I had made contact with Charlie Freak about 3 years, I think, or maybe 4 years before the scamdemic broke.
Yeah.
So it's not as if he suddenly popped out of the woodwork once COVID had become a thing.
Yeah, I was going to say that because I'd seen your videos. Sorry to interrupt, Mark. I'd seen that. Yeah.
So I'd done some videos with Charlie talking about music and talking about songs. So he reached out to me, I think it was probably 2016, something like that, maybe 2015. And he wanted to talk to me about this book series that he'd done, 150 greatest rock albums.
Okay.
And he wanted to really get inside the lyrics of some of these rock bands that he really admired. And he'd interpreted what he felt they were trying to communicate through these songs. So we did a few shows along those lines, and I found them very fascinating. And then the COVID scam broke, and Charlie started talking about the Q plan and such. And he said he wanted to come on and do some shows with me about this. So having already known him by that point, and having already come to trust him and consider him a friend, I was like, sure, why not? Let's get some insights into this. And so one show became 2, became 3, and now I've done 4 shows with him. And I'm now at the stage where, and what I said to him all along, and what I've mentioned in previous interviews, is I am a researcher.
Yes.
And I'm a professional researcher. And if I'd put out my first book, Musical Truth Volume 1, with some of the claims that are in it, without being able to back those claims up with citations and references, I would have been taken to task over some of the things that I'd said. And very few people would have taken my claims seriously. And I would probably have been called out as a charlatan and a fraud, because I'm just coming out with these wild claims to sell books or whatever, is what people might have said. So I've said things like, many of your favorite household name A-list artists show all the signs of having undergone trauma-based mind control programming and satanic ritual abuse. That's a pretty bold claim to come out and make, unless you have a whole load of documentary evidence, video evidence, and in some cases, testimonials straight from the mouths of these very people themselves to back it up. So one thing you'll notice about my books is I have pages and pages of resources and citations where I show you where I got the information from, lest anyone should think I'm just pulling this stuff out of my arse. So when it comes to all these wild and bold claims that have been made about the Q plan, about what Donald Trump and his team have apparently been doing behind the scenes, these are some pretty outrageous claims by anybody's standards. And as a researcher, I require the kind of proofs and evidence that other people have told me they need from me. So if I'm coming up with pages of resources and citations to show where my claims come from, anyone making these claims, as far as I'm concerned, needs to be able to provide those same proofs. I'm told that there's little clues, there's little symbolic indicators. There's little cryptic comments made here and there. There's, you know, symbols and images and icons that pertain to certain things happening. They aren't the same as proofs.
No, they're not.
Because clues and cryptic indicators are open to interpretation.
Yeah.
One man's interpretation of what that means is going to be entirely different to the next man's interpretation of what they mean. So that doesn't count as proof. Someone's opinion is not proof. Someone's intuition is not proof. These are not verifiable, measurable, quantifiable things. And the whole saga has just been dragged out so long now, and the can has been kicked so far down the road, and so many times we've been told, oh, such and such is going to happen on this date, big things, and it doesn't. Well, you see, that's because they had to change their plan because this unforeseen thing came along. Don't worry, it'll all be sorted by this date. You wait for that date, nothing happens. Oh, well, don't worry, no, they've revised it. Now it's going to be this date. Date comes, date goes. Next date comes, next date goes. There's got to come a point where you just say, I'm done, I'm through. And I mentioned on a video that I did the other day, a lyric from the Smiths song, How Soon Is Now, speaks to me in this regard. It's the part of the song where Morrissey sings, when you say that it's happening now, when exactly do you mean? See, I've already waited so long, and now all hope is gone. So I'm at the stage now where, because nothing verifiable, quantifiable has happened, and yeah, I've seen the anomalies. I know there's some unexplained things going on.
Sure.
You know, there appear to be CGI mock-ups of certain famous people being used, the Queen being the best example. So just yesterday, we had what purported to be the Queen on TV telling everyone they should take the vaccine and they're selfish if they don't.
Yeah, I saw
nothing selfish about sitting upon trillions and trillions of pounds worth of wealth when there's suffering and hardship and homelessness in the world. Nothing selfish about protecting your paedophile son from exposure for his relationships with known child traffickers, sex traffickers and other paedophiles. Nothing selfish about that. But it is selfish if you don't take the vaccine. But what we had yesterday was a CGI mock-up of the Queen. So that's a bit strange. They've been wheeling out a fake Prince Charles. Where's the real Prince Charles? So there's a lot of anomalies. There's a lot of strange things going on. I'm not denying that.
No.
But I'm at the stage now where, because there's not any verifiable proofs, I'm through with all the coded cryptic stuff, all the symbolism. And my default position now is it's all been a big psyop, and there's nothing going on behind the scenes with any kind of White Hats Alliance unless I see some evidence to convince me otherwise. And I would like nothing more than for that evidence to emerge and for me to have to, at a future date, put my hand up and say, I was wrong. I should have kept the faith. I should have trusted the plan. I called it wrong. I can see it now. But until that day comes, my position is it has been a psyop, devastating though it is for me to have to say that. And a large part of it has been to cause all these American patriots that I mentioned earlier with their cabinets full of firearms to stand down and do nothing on the grounds that Q's got it. The alliance is in control. We just have to grab our popcorn and watch.
Yeah. I mean, I'm aware of the time, Mark, and I realise we need to round up soon. But I mean, I've been very much like you for all of that. I've looked at everything, but I've always sat on the fence. I've been hopeful. You know, I've wanted to believe it. But something which I don't think we're going to get on to talk about today is just shame, which is religion and revelations, because I've also been following people who very much point out all the symbolism regarding Trump and, you know, in terms of biblical texts and stuff. And that's kind of quite compelling in the other side, to be honest, that, you know, that it is all a psyop, like you just said.
And I've looked at a lot of that, and you know, there's something there. There's something there, or there seems to be something there. And also Trump as a time traveler. Again, we don't have time to get into it big time now, but this is something I've researched for the new book.
Right, okay.
There was a series of books that came out in Now, when was it? I'm trying to remember what decade it was.
I've
It was
seen.
decades and decades and decades
Yeah,
ago, but
yeah.
it was Baron Trump.
That's right. Yeah,
There
I've
were
seen that.
a couple of, it was early part of the 20th century,
Yeah.
early 1900s, I'm sure it was. And there was a character called Baron Trump.
That's right.
And he had a mentor that would speak to him and give him knowledge, and he was known as Don.
Yeah.
And he would have all these various adventures, and there's all kinds of other stuff in there. But so we have Donald Trump, and his son's name is Baron, and there's lots of strange stuff there that I can't explain.
No,
but
the picture as well. I mean, the picture is on that book as well is the image of Donald Trump's son, isn't it? So it is really strange. But just to round up, Mark, because obviously I'd really love to do this again, and we can change the topic. We can go into more depth on that stuff. But the last thing I want to touch on is you've obviously done the trilogy, the 3 videos on common law with Jackie Phoenix, John Smith, and Christopher James. That's right, isn't it? So in relation to, so we're just going to push Q out the side, in relation to Agenda 20 and 2021, 2030, do you think from those interviews that common law is a remedy for what we're going through at the moment? What has been your conclusion out of those 3 interviews that you did?
I'm told by all concerned that it is. But unfortunately, I mean, it's 4 interviews I've done, really, because there's Michael O'Byrne-Sear as well.
Yeah, okay, sorry, yeah, that was a while back, wasn't it?
Launching those private criminal prosecutions. So you've got Michael O'Byrne-Sear, John Smith, Christopher James, Jackie Phoenix. The disappointing thing for me is the fact that all of them claim expertise in the area of common law and the Magna Carta and the Constitution, but there's disagreement among all of them in terms of how it should be applied.
Yeah.
So some will say Article 61 is absolutely the way to go and it's still completely valid. Others will say, no, that's no longer valid, it's no longer actionable. And there's lots of disagreement and infighting on whose method is the way to go. That's supremely disappointing at a time when our back's against the wall and we need unity more than ever.
Yeah, I agree.
My other concern is that if common law is the way to go, and from what I've been told, it certainly seems to be. But unless everyone acknowledges this, it's never going to be able to be made to stick. So every rank and file police officer out there on the street, every government employee, and every other member of the public is going to need to be on the same page in terms of their comprehensions of the power of common law if it's ever going to be made to work. Otherwise, it'll be a best kept secret among just a select few. And
they're not on the same page already, are they? So
everyone's got to be on the same page or it's just not going to work. So that's my simple and quick answer to that.
Right. Okay, that's fine. So as I say, we can't get into, sadly, we can't get into more of the religious stuff, Revelations. But I do love the Ephesians quote of put on the whole armor of God. And you'll be able to stand against the wiles of the devil, and we wrestle against flesh and blood, but not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers and rulers of darkness of this world, which is, we know where we're at. That's the negative side. That's what we're trying to stand up against. Quickly, I want people now to go away and look at your stuff. So you mentioned your musical freedom. You're starting to do, because obviously we've touched on all the people who haven't spoken out, but you're doing something in your musical freedom, is that right, with people who are actually saying some good stuff about what's going on at the moment?
Well, in Musical Truth Volume 3, I'm calling out the honourable exceptions who have bravely spoken out against tyranny and have used their level of influence for actually some good, some positive. So I'm naming a lot of those names. And it's many lesser known artists as well. There's a lot of musicians and producers and rappers that most people will be unaware of, but I feel they justify some honorary mentions because they've been saying what needs to be said in the form of their music. So that's coming in Musical Truth Volume 3. I will have to run now, unfortunately.
Right, okay.
It would be good to have another chat with you at some point.
Absolutely,
as you say,
yeah.
There's many other things we can get into.
I haven't even got your Boris impression yet, so I'm, really disappointed in that because I was looking forward to that. So Thank you. If you want to just end on Boris.
Three things I would like the British public to remember. Very, very important. Fraud, treason, and genocide. And I would like to say that I'll address you all again in 3 weeks' time. But by then, I strongly expect to have been hung for treason on the gallows.
It's not the best Boris impersonation. The Bill Gates sometimes works. Everybody's got to have the vaccine. We can only open up society again when my bank account reaches 35 trillion. So please take your vaccine.
That is absolutely brilliant. Listen, guys, you can find more on Mark Devlin at markdevlin.com. Is that right? Your website?
DJMarkDevlin.com.
Sorry, DJMarkDevlin.com. Obviously, his YouTube channel. You'll find all his podcasts and his amazing videos. So thank you again so much, Mark. You're an absolute hero. Keep up the good fight, and I look forward to chatting to you again soon.
Well, thanks a lot, Karen. Thanks for the opportunity today, and thanks for all that you're doing as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.